In late October 2024, a collection of leaders and dignitaries hailing from 36 world nations descended upon the city of Kazan in Russia. Boasting some truly stunning architecture, over 1 million residents, and the status of the capital of the Russian Republic of Tatarstan, Kazan is a vibrant city that makes a habit of welcoming tourists from all across the globe. But on this occasion, the city's visitors had come strictly on business. Made up of delegations from places as far-flung as China, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Malaysia, and dozens more, Kazan's foreign visitors weren't there to celebrate Russian President Vladimir Putin, nor to engage in geopolitical pageantry, nor to even plead with Putin to stop the war in Ukraine. Instead, the nations of the world had gathered in Kazan to be part of a little something called BRICS. First founded over 15 years ago by the nations of Russia, Brazil, China, and India, BRICS is an intergovernmental organization that's gone from geopolitical curiosity to rising global powerhouse. Today it comprises 9 powerful nations. It does business in 8 official languages, it comprises 30% of the world's land surface, and holds 45% of the global population. The organization's waitlist includes dozens of nations spread out across 4 continents. BRICS runs a global financial institution that rivals the International Monetary Fund. It intends to one day rival the Western world on every conceivable metric of economics, and it hopes to become an enduring counterweight to global institutions like the G7, the World Bank, and other globalist bastions that are dominated by the influence of the global West. But with BRICS growing in power and pulling in a wider and wider array of nations that the US, the European Union, and other Western power players consider to be hostile, global experts, analysts, and pundits have started to center in on a critical question. What if the BRICS organization became a military alliance? Well, today we're going to dive into the prospect of a militarized BRICS, the motivations that would cause BRICS nations to consider such a thing, the impressive military power that such an alliance could command, and the likelihood that the nations of the BRICS organization might one day take the leap.
You don't need to be famous to have your name, address, and personal info plastered all across the internet. It just kinda happens, and it happens because of shady companies who do data brokerage. Incognito, they're a service that helps remove your personal data from public databases and people's search sites, and they're also today's sponsor. Their unlimited plan adds custom removals, which lets you submit specific links exposing your info even outside of Incogni's usual network of data brokers that they're used to hassling to get rid of your information. And, well, their privacy team will work to get that custom data, that custom link that you sent them taken down. You can set as many as you find, just paste the URL, and they handle the legal requests and all the follow-up. Some things like government records, social platforms, those are off limits. But most sites absolutely can be got rid of. So take your personal data back with Incogni. Use the code WarFronts at incogni.com/WarFronts to get 60% off an annual plan. And now back to today's episode.
When the BRICS organization first came into being, it was known by the acronym BRIC, or BRIC, with each letter of the name corresponding to the starting letter of one of its founding members. B for Brazil, R for Russia, I for India, and C for China. The name wasn't their idea. It actually came from a 2001 article written by Jim O'Neill, who worked for Goldman Sachs and who had predicted at that time that the 4 rapidly advancing nations he'd picked out were destined to grow and rival the US and Europe. The 4 BRIC nations, perhaps unsurprisingly, seemed to like the idea, and after nearly a decade of meetings, more meetings, and meetings about meetings, and meetings to schedule opportunities to have more meetings, they finally sealed the deal in Yekaterinburg in Russia in 2009. The goal at the start was for the 4 founding BRIC nations to band together, leveraging their shared economic power and address fundamental issues that had made problems for them for a very long time. These included the world's Western-controlled, inefficient, and arguably broken financial institutions. It included the way that developing nations tended to be ostracized and kept out of geopolitical decision-making, and it included the 4 nations' collective vulnerability to economic shocks, like the then ongoing Great Recession. Catastrophes like the recession, or problematic institutions like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, had a way of becoming the BRIC nations' problem, despite the BRIC nations never really getting a say in how they were managed. A year and a half after BRIC first came together, South Africa was incorporated into the group courtesy of an invite from China, and with the organization's name changed to the somewhat catchier title of BRICS, they got to work changing the world. Since then, the BRICS nations have worked hard to create an alternative global financial institution to rival the IMF and the World Bank. Known as the New Development Bank, the BRICS institution today does business with a range of world nations, including not just 5, but 10 core members. Headed by former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff, the bank leverages the equivalent of hundreds of billions of US dollars and now works together with the World Bank while supporting a range of global development initiatives. BRICS contributions to global infrastructure development totaled over $32 billion by the end of 2022. BRICS has worked for years on a plan to build an alternative network of optical fiber submarine cables allowing secure communications between BRICS nations without being subject to the powers of America's National Security Agency, and they've worked toward an organization-wide alternative to the global SWIFT payment system, a challenge that most of the BRICS nations have already conquered on their own. As BRICS has gotten bigger, it's welcomed several new members, although mercifully it hasn't attempted to fit those new members into an even longer acronym. On the 1st of January 2024, BRICS welcomed Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Iran and Ethiopia to the bloc. Saudi Arabia is still considering its invitation to join, although the 6th and final nation BRICS invited, Argentina, declined the invitation on foreign policy grounds. Several nations are currently under consideration for membership, including NATO member nation Turkey, as well as rising regional players like Pakistan, Indonesia, and Azerbaijan. Membership in the group is highly in demand, and 9 other world nations are considered BRICS partners, including the considerable economic forces of Nigeria, Malaysia, and Vietnam. But while BRICS has kept both its core members and its core priorities over the span of the last decade and a half, the organization has, for lack of a better word, undergone a bit of a vibe shift. It was founded in a time when China's economic power still lagged behind the United States, when Russia was fresh off the sting of losing global superpower status, when the name Narendra Modi wasn't yet a household name in most of India, and when Brazil's economic potential in the long run was unclear. These were times when problems like World Bank inefficiency and dependence on the dollar certainly had practical implications, but they typically weren't life and death. Today, not only is China the world's newest superpower, not only are India and Brazil becoming increasingly critical global players, but the nations of BRICS have had their outlook fundamentally altered by a difficult last decade. Russia has taken an economic beating from the US and the EU for years, especially since it began an invasion of Ukraine that it insists was justified. China has found itself embroiled in trade wars with the United States and has confirmed its suspicions the hard way that no matter what sort of sweet talk the West is engaged in, those same nations never had the intention of coming gently into a new multipolar world. India under Narendra Modi has been transformed. Brazil under Lula, then Bolsonaro, then Lula again, has learned hard lessons in the intervening years. South Africa has hardly managed to stay afloat. Meanwhile, the 4 nations BRICS just added include a country in Ethiopia with an expansionist leader who's freshly coming off a genocide, a country in Egypt that suffered 2 revolutions since the 4 BRIC nations agreed on their initial arrangements, a country in the UAE that's backed warlords and revolutions around the world, and a country in Iran that's currently staring down one of America's closest allies, Israel. So, while calling out the vibe shift of the BRICS organization may be accurate, it could also be a bit of an understatement. When the group met in 2024, it was a landmark moment for Vladimir Putin's Russia, proving that Russia had survived the West's attempts to isolate it and allowing the country to play host to a number of important geopolitical developments at the conference. During the conference, BRICS nations issued joint declarations about the disruptive effect of, quote, unlawful, unilateral, coercive measures, including illegal sanctions, and tacitly looked past elements of international law that on paper would obligate some attendees to take up divisive issues with others. Shrewd analysts around the world pointed to the group's growing power and influence, their shared dissatisfaction with the West, and their shared grievances over a world order that they're increasingly working to supplant. As reporter Keith Johnson put it, writing for Foreign Policy, quoting here, outside of Washington and the G7 and the European Union, it is hard to appreciate just how much resentment there is of Western hypocrisy and hegemony, all more to helping to bond the loose membership of BRICS. Of course, not every BRICS nation approaches that challenge the same way. For China, for example, BRICS is a financial extension of its global infrastructure and development efforts, predominantly its Belt and Road Initiative, and it's a way to harness the power, diplomatic clout, and connections of several important nations with hopes of becoming the undisputed leader of the global south. For Russia, and for Iran as well, BRICS is a way to count and court its friends at a sensitive moment, relying on a non-Western collective that can help it survive its recent split from Europe. For India, BRICS is a way to ensure that the country will be a power player in the new multipolar world that comes after the one we live in now, maybe in 20 years, maybe in 50, maybe 100. For several of the nations looking to join, BRICS would be a guarantee that they can remain solvent, even if they were to take actions that land them in hot water with a sanctions-happy Western world. Every BRICS nation has its own goals, its own take on the group, and its own way of interacting with the collective. But together, the position they take is clear. It's in opposition to a world order that holds Europe and America at its center. So, as much of the Western world has looked upon the evolution of BRICS with trepidation, it's not been too much of a leap to imagine BRICS not just as an economic organization, but perhaps even a military one. After all, for nations that want to be immune from Western world order, it's not hard to imagine that the next step after countering the G7 or the IMF would be to counter NATO or the American-led alliances of the Indo-Pacific. And while there is a lot of nuance required to discuss such a topic, we've got to start with perhaps the least nuanced part of the entire conversation: sheer military power. Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it. BRICS, as it stands today, consists of 9 nations, each of which can leverage substantial military might in their own ways, and some of which have immense potential as powerhouses on a regional or global stage, even all by themselves. Rather than try and account for the totality of each country's military strength, however, we're going to explore the metrics that are most relevant to each nation as part of an international military coalition. Those include advanced military hardware, major naval vessels, aggregate manpower, and available air power. That is to say, the metrics that would allow them to stand up to existing international alliances, primarily NATO. Okay. So we'll start with Russia, a nation that continues to prove that it's militarily viable in large-scale open warfare despite its early challenges in Ukraine. The Russian armed forces are the world's 5th largest military force, comprising 1.15 active duty troops and nearly 2 million additional reservists, and its active duty numbers are expected to jump to 1.5 million within the next 3 years. On the ground, Russian forces have taken a heavy shellacking in Ukraine, with massive numbers of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles being destroyed or damaged. But according to Ukraine's military commander-in-chief, Russia today leverages some 3,500 tanks and nearly 9,000 armored personnel carriers in combat. Russia's greatest strength, its artillery, comprises many thousands of pieces capable of firing incredible numbers of shells. On the water, Russia's Black Sea Fleet and its Admiral Kuznetsov aircraft carrier have proven more than a little disappointing for Moscow, but the nation still fields 3 relatively strong naval fleets in addition to the Black Sea Fleet. Russia's air wing is its most impressive asset, leveraging many hundreds of modern fighter jets, hundreds more attack aircraft, and over 100 supersonic and subsonic strategic bombers, and its purportedly stealthy, supposedly 5th-generation Sukhoi Su-57. Alongside Russia, it's China that would serve as the other great powerhouse within a BRICS military alliance, and quite possibly, it's the more formidable of the two. China boasts over 2 million active personnel in its military, the largest active force in the world, plus another 500,000 in reserve. It leverages nearly 5,000 main battle tanks, tens of thousands of other critical heavy fighting vehicles and artillery pieces, and a highly robust rocket force, despite enduring concerns about corruption within the rocket force ranks. Its navy is the country's pride and joy, soon to boast 3 aircraft carriers, plus 50 destroyers, hundreds of other combat-ready ships, and several ballistic missile submarines. In the air, China flies one of only 2 meaningful air fleets of stealth aircraft in the world, with an estimated 200-plus J-20 stealth multi-role fighters. It also flies hundreds of 4th-generation multi-role and air superiority aircraft and well over 200 strategic bomber aircraft. The Indian Armed Forces aren't to be trifled with either, boasting the world's second-largest active fighting force at nearly 1.5 million, plus nearly 1.2 million reservists. India is just as proud of its navy as China, today fielding 2 active aircraft carriers, 2 ballistic missile submarines, and several dozen major surface and subsurface combat vessels. India's army boasts over 1.2 million soldiers, an absolutely mind-boggling total, and about 5,000 more main battle tanks to add to BRICS' collective sum. Though India lacks much in the way of advanced artillery, they've got immense numbers of field guns that are suitable for grinding attritional warfare similar to Russia. Finally, in the air, India brings about 350 advanced fighter aircraft, plus a couple of hundred older model aircraft. It's there, however, where the list of major BRICS power players is cut short. Brazil doesn't bring nearly as much in terms of overall numbers, although its 334,000 active duty troops and 1.3 million reservists make it Latin America's largest fighting force. On the ground, it only leverages a few hundred main battle tanks, none of which are particularly new, and a few hundred artillery pieces. On the sea, it fields only 8 major surface combat vessels and 4 attack submarines, while its air force consists of a handful of advanced JAS-39 Gripen aircraft and a variety of older jets and prop-driven attack aircraft. South Africa's military features only about 100,000 active and reserve personnel combined, armed with less than 100 main battle tanks in active service, a few hundred infantry fighting vehicles, and not much in the way of sophisticated artillery. It sails a total of 4 frigates and 3 attack submarines, and while it too flies the Swedish-made Gripen as the point aircraft of its air wing, it flies a total of 17 for combat purposes, with only minimal backup. And while the 4 militaries of BRICS' new arrivals each have their strengths, none of the 4 are going to be changing the equation that much. The Emirates can bring a fairly substantial ground force, including several hundred relatively modern French tanks and many hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles, while it flies dozens of American-made F-16s and will soon receive dozens of French Rafale aircraft. It falls short, however, in overall manpower, naval power, and aggregate equipment numbers. Iran brings the 9th largest active military force in the world with over 600,000 personnel, and they've got both a robust unconventional warfare branch and a large aggregate amount of ground equipment. That equipment, however, is mostly outdated and is in a questionable state of repair. It's also an open question how much of its out-of-date air force can even fly, and its navy is relatively small as well. Ethiopia fields predominantly Soviet-era ground equipment, a handful of relatively advanced post-Soviet fighter jets, and no meaningful naval vessels, only reconstituting its navy in 2018 after shutting it down in 1996. Of the 4 new arrivals, Egypt is probably the most formidable. Its army is decently sized at over 300,000 active personnel, and it fields over 1,300 American-designed M1 Abrams main battle tanks, as well as frankly ridiculous aggregate numbers of older ground fighting kit. Its navy fields 8 attack subs and 20 meaningful surface combat vessels, while it flies over 200 F-16s and plans to fly another 100-odd Russian and French advanced aircraft by the end of the decade. But there's more to the question of military viability as a cohesive alliance than what each country has in its arsenal. And here, we've got to talk about a few key factors, starting with simple geography. We'll make a comparison to the nations of NATO, the vast majority of which are concentrated in Europe, where despite a nearly 1,600-mile or 2,600-kilometer border with Russia after the addition of Finland in 2023, the alliance has some very meaningful geographic advantages. It controls both coasts of the North Atlantic, as well as choke points to the Mediterranean and Baltic Seas, while facing meaningful military threats only across one broad front line, facing Russia and the Middle East, and across one vast ocean, when accounting for America and Canada's Pacific coast. For the nations of BRICS, the situation's a bit more complicated. 6 of the 9 BRICS nations, Ethiopia, Egypt, Iran, the Emirates, Brazil, and South Africa, share no land border with any other BRICS nation. South Africa's closest fellow BRICS nation is Ethiopia, almost 5,000 kilometers away, while Brazil's closest fellow BRICS nation, South Africa, is nearly 8,000 kilometers away. You could trace a consistent path across land from India to China to Russia, but China and India's border is blocked by the high Himalayas, while China connects primarily to the vast open expanses of Russia's Far East, with China's most significant city on the Russian border, Hai-He, is still over 5,500 kilometers from Moscow. So, immediately, a BRICS military alliance would face significant geographical constraints of a kind that NATO just simply doesn't have to deal with. Bearing that in mind, however, we don't have to simply write the idea off. Instead, we turn to the question of potential solutions and specifically whether the nations of BRICS could use other logistical capabilities to make good on a collective defense pact. If we assume that BRICS would adopt a similar core principle to NATO's Article 5, where an attack on one member nation is interpreted as an attack on all, do the members of BRICS actually have the capacity to rush to one another's defense? And the answer here, unfortunately for the alliance, is, well, probably not, at least not in any meaningful way. Without substantial land bridges between them, the nations of BRICS would have to rely on air and sea power to transport troops between them. And here, the situation just isn't very promising. Take, say, a hypothetical situation in which the members of BRICS rushed to the defense of Ethiopia, as Ethiopia came under hypothetical attack from, let's imagine, some version of Sudan that was in a state to pose an existential threat to its neighbor. Reference, the Sudan of today is decisively not. In this scenario, landlocked Ethiopia could only be supported directly by air, while any support to a potential counterattack via Egypt to Sudan's north would have to rely on whatever mass numbers of troops could get to Egypt by sea. In this situation, strategic airlift capability would matter most of all, but strategic airlifters are not something that BRICS nations possess in massive numbers. Using a reasonable portion of its strategic airlift fleet, rather than engaging in some hypothetical where 100% of all airlifters are perfectly positioned to intervene, Russia could perhaps get 3,000 to 5,000 troops from the southerly city of Krasnodar to Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, within a couple of days, using the subset of its longest-range strategic airlifters that we could reasonably assume might get to Krasnodar promptly. It would have a far harder time, however, getting meaningful numbers of fighter or attack aircraft there. Russia possesses only 20-odd aerial refueling tankers, and a subset of them could perhaps bring a few dozen aircraft to Ethiopia's limited airfields over a few days via shuttle runs. The Emirati Air Force has a total of 8 strategic airlifters and 3 tankers. India has a total of 6 tankers and 28 strategic airlifters. And even China has less than 30 tankers and 70 strategic airlifters. Assuming that maybe 1 in 3 of those aircraft from each nation could be devoted to collective defense obligations in a pinch, that is a dismal capacity, and it would be further constrained by Ethiopia's limited airfields and infrastructure, which could potentially take over a decade to upgrade to an alliance standard. All the other BRICS nations would be functionally unable to intervene by air, and trying to intervene in Ethiopia isn't even a worst-case scenario. Imagine trying to do the same for South Africa or Brazil. Then, actually getting troops in place for a hypothetical Egyptian counterattack would be a whole other challenge. To get there, BRICS nations would have to use either the Suez Canal or, less reliably, the broadly NATO-controlled Mediterranean. While China and India could each probably send an aircraft carrier, neither nation's troop transport ships are thought to be ready for intercontinental operations, while the navies of most other BRICS nations are simply not up to the job. Russia has very few blue water landing ships, even in theory, without accounting for vessel or crew readiness problems, and even the nearby Emirates have next to no capacity. Iran could, in theory, send a few ships, but that's if they can stay afloat for the voyage. Brazil and South Africa just don't have the capacity. In addition to the hypothetical alliance's relative lack of rapid response capability, particularly for its further-flung allies, it's got a range of other issues to deal with, but the major one is the alliance's members' lack of combat experience. Unlike, say, the nations of NATO, who've at least rotated in and out of various US-led coalitions and picked up nominal experience, most of the member nations of BRICS have had a militarily quiet past few decades. China and India have hardly been engaged in combat at all. Same for Brazil and South Africa. Iran has been involved in operations in the Middle East, but not in any large-scale way besides its unconventional warfare branch and its back-and-forth strikes with Israel. The Emirates have been involved in combat operations in Yemen. Both they and the UAE carried out interventions operations in Libya, and Ethiopia has fought a number of internal conflicts while patrolling neighboring Somalia with thousands of troops. Russia, of course, is the exception, fighting a now nearly 3-year war in Ukraine. But has Russia learned? inexperience in large-scale combat is about more than just being worried that one's troops might hold their knives by the pointy end. Recall back to the failure and collapse of Russia's first wave advance on Kyiv in the early days of its 2022 invasion, and we can get a taste of the broader issue. Until complex plans for logistical operations are tested in real time, a country cannot reasonably trust that they work. We discussed the prospect of a mass strategic airlift of troops from Russia, China, and India to Ethiopia, but the fundamental truth of the matter is that none of those three nations have attempted an urgent strategic airlift on that scale. When done just right, such an airlift can be a beautiful thing. Take the United States' stunningly efficient air operations in what was otherwise a disastrous withdrawal from Kabul, Afghanistan. But for the United States, well-honed logistical and support capacity is the thing that underpins everything else. For just about every BRICS member nation, it's never been attempted at scale in a crisis. That being said, a BRICS alliance would certainly have a few key advantages. Take, for example, the sheer manufacturing capacity that its members can bring to bear. Russia is in the process of pivoting to a semi-permanent war economy and has proved it can manufacture munitions at a mind-bending scale. India and China are two of the world's top 5 biggest manufacturing economies and also have the potential to win wars on sheer numbers, especially if they were to direct conscription efforts towards their combined population of 2.8 billion people. Several BRICS nations boast world-class aerospace bureaus and firms: Sukhoi and Mikoyan in Russia, Hindustan Aeronautics in India, Embraer in Brazil, and Chengdu and Shenyang in China. They've also got a quiet but very meaningful potential ally in Saudi Arabia, a nation that's still sitting on its invitation to join the BRICS organization, but brings both incredible amounts of oil and incredible sums of oil money if it were to lend its support to the group. And finally, there's the nuclear angle to consider. Much like the United States, France, and Britain do for the nations of NATO, the nations of BRICS would be more than capable of providing a nuclear umbrella for their 6 non-nuclear nations by way of the arsenals of Russia, China, and India. India is the smallest of the bunch, with a measly 172 estimated warheads in its arsenal, per the Arms Control Association, not even enough to wipe out every major city on Earth. Weak. Russia is the largest, with over 5,500 total warheads, including those in storage, and over 1,000 deployed. China is the one sitting in the middle, with about 500 estimated at the time of writing, but it's on pace to catch up with Russia and the United States within the next decade or two. The three nations are well accustomed to nuclear dialogue. Just this September, they all agreed to collaborate on building a nuclear power plant on the moon, in keeping with China and Russia's objective to build a lunar base and India's objective to fly a manned mission to the moon by 2040. While forming a cohesive nuclear umbrella is about more than just handshake deals, we must emphasize that the basis for a deal is certainly there. And in a collective defense organization where several states are nuclear armed, the non-nuclear nations involved can feel a whole lot safer about the credibility of their allies' threat. Alright, so that's the potency of a potential BRICS military alliance. Certainly not a union of 9 direct equal military powers, and certainly a union where the capacity for rapid response in conventional warfare scenarios would be a bit suspect, but where a nuclear umbrella, diplomatic and economic clout, and sheer military numbers on paper could potentially go a long way. But with that package in mind, it's time to ask the ultimate question: would they actually do it? Like any geopolitical choice, there's a list of reasons to engage and a list of reasons not to. But in this case, some of the divides that BRICS members share might become real barriers to an organization under a collective defense framework. Individual BRICS members have their share of disputes. China and India just spent several years in a bitter board of disputes that they've only just resolved, while Vladimir Putin can't visit South Africa without fear of being arrested because South Africa is party to the International Criminal Court, which has called for Putin's arrest. Egypt and the Emirates both have strong defense relationships with the US, and Egypt is one of the biggest debtor nations to the IMF. Several BRICS members have defense relationships with various NATO nations, despite the broad opposition of many bloc members to NATO entirely. South Africa's energy infrastructure problems, Brazil's political situation, China's economic downturn, Russia and Iran's crush of sanctions, and pre-existing rivalries between the Gulf states and Iran, Egypt and Ethiopia, and China and Russia all add to the potential for new issues to arise. Then the group has had trouble coming to even basic procedural agreements on the matters they do handle, and their 4 founding members are split on the idea of adding new voices to the club, with China and Russia generally in favor and Brazil and India generally against. The group's core nations reckon with fundamental divides like the preference for democracy versus the preference for authoritarianism, and their basic outlook on major global powers like the United States as good friends, bitter enemies, or something in between. It's difficult to ignore the bloc's overall move toward a more strongly anti-US, anti-EU, anti-democratic stance, with a new addition of authoritarian and West-averse nations like Iran and Ethiopia, and only relatively neutral nations, not ones of opposite viewpoints, to balance them out in the UAE and Egypt. The question of whether to wait and prepare for the eventual decline of the Western world versus taking proactive steps to accelerate that decline will be an issue the bloc is increasingly forced to confront. But the value to forming a collective defense organization might just be unchanged, regardless of the answer to that question. For nations that actively want to bring about the decline of the global West in order to take its place, gathering together to form an explicit counterweight to NATO would certainly further that goal. Power of all 9 nations, let alone any new arrivals, is greater than 1, and in the situations where they all agree to throw their weight around, they'd have far more success than they would by themselves. But even for those nations that are content to watch the process play out, they'd be proactively ensuring their membership in the world-leading organization that comes afterward with reliable defense agreements to secure their spot. There's certainly an argument that BRICS, as it is today, risks saying the quiet part out loud, inviting the US, Europe, and East Asia into a formalized two-party competition and potentially prompting those adversaries to reverse or at least slow what the BRICS nations see as a decline. But BRICS, as it is now, is already saying that quiet part out loud, and while organizing militarily would say it louder, it wouldn't fundamentally change a message that the West has already received. And finally, there's one more question to answer today, the question of a concrete purpose. Waiting for the downfall of the West is not nothing, but it is a decades-long ambition, and one that's partly theoretical. Look at NATO, for contrast. This is an organization born out of very real fears of the Soviet Union at the start of the Cold War, and continued after the Cold War largely due to fears of Russian aggression, which have since played out multiple times in the 21st century. But BRICS doesn't have that. If the group's members agree that the West is in decline and have some reasonable expectation that neither the US nor Europe would rather end the world by fire and brimstone than settle for second place a few decades from now, then what's there to fight? India has its rivalry with Pakistan to consider, but that's been contained for well over half a century. Ethiopia is concerned about Somalia, but the combined power of BRICS is more than a little bit of overkill where Somalia is concerned. Russia has its ongoing invasion of Ukraine, but not even the most generously worded collective defense treaty would be able to interpret Russia's choice to invade Ukraine as an attack on Russia. Look at the actual interests of BRICS nations, look at the threats they face, and collective defense just isn't quite the right answer. For some nations, it's not inconceivable to think that they'd be all right with some collective offense, but that's a tough thing to put in writing without driving most of the bloc away and explicitly putting Earth on the path to World War III. Barring that, most BRICS nations just don't have much to gain from a military alliance. Russia's interests lie in Eastern Europe, indulging in brinksmanship and land grabs of its own making. China's expansionism in the South China Sea and a potential Taiwan takeover, Iraq's instigated by China, no matter how badly the CCP might wish to reframe it. And its policies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have far more to do with economic outreach than war. Brazil and South Africa face no meaningful external threats to their sovereignty, the UAE has way too much money to waste it on war, and Iran is too deep in its own morass to be of any help to anybody else. India is working hard to become a bridge nation between East and West. Egypt is working hard to become a bridge between Israel, the US, and the Arab world. And Ethiopia is just doing whatever its dictator Abiy Ahmed decides he'd like to do that day. And we got to be clear, we can't sit here and claim that there's zero value to a mutual defense treaty. Certainly, if you asked each member of the BRICS collective the binary question, would you like these other nations to help make sure you don't get attacked, yes or no? The answer is obviously yes. But there's a massive difference between preferring the convenience of a collective defense treaty and having a specific reason to chase it. And right now, there's no reason. Will BRICS one day agree to a treaty of collective defense? Maybe. Maybe not. But if they do, it won't be a concrete agreement to try and destroy the West. In fact, even its basic value as a treaty to guarantee a response to conventional attack may not be nearly as reliable on paper as that of NATO or of other multilateral defense agreements around the world. Bringing the BRICS countries under a nuclear umbrella, giving group assurances that should deter anybody from attacking them, creating a geopolitical counterweight to NATO, there are good arguments for all of that. But if such a military alliance does come about, then it's best viewed as a sort of nuclear-capable window dressing for an organization whose real power is concentrated elsewhere.